This is the official good morning. Today is a very special day for all of us connected with the USS Slater and the Escort Historical Museum, which is housed here. Today is the 223rd anniversary of the creation of the Revenue Cutter Service on August 4th, 1790. Beginning then, generations of brave men and women have been continuously at sea, protecting our waters and shorelines. Since 1915, it has been known by its present name, the Coast Guard. But one thing has never changed: the service's enduring commitment to its motto, Semper Paratus, always ready. I would now invite Chief Warrant Officer Dick Walker to the podium for the purpose of providing a brief history of the service.
As Steve said, the Coast Guard came into existence as a result of legislation signed by President Washington in 1790. Alexander Hamilton being the first Secretary of the Treasury, he was also the first boss, you might say, of what would become the Coast Guard. All kidding aside, the Revenue Cutter Service wouldn't have anybody to man their ships if it wasn't for the Continental Navy, because the Navy had been disbanded after the end of the Revolution. And when the Revenue Cutter Service was organized, most of the officers and men who manned the first cutters were former Navy veterans from the Revolutionary War period. So there is a historic connection between the Navy and the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard, as a military service, has participated in every maritime naval war that the United States has ever been involved with, right up till and including today. I emailed with a fellow in Australia, and he has a neighbor who is a World War II Australian Army veteran. And the Coast Guard and the Aussies established a rapport early on, and it seemed that every time an LST loaded with Aussies would hit the beach, invariably the ship was manned by Coast Guardsmen. During World War II, the Coast Guard manned about 750 Navy and Army vessels. This did lead to some interesting situations. The Navy forbade any kind of official recognition of the smaller service. And there is a photograph in a book that shows 3 LSTs lined up against the beach with their bow doors open and their ramps down, and Aussies marching out giving the thumbs up insignia. And inside, where the door would have been shut and nobody would see it when the vessel was at sea, on each one, neatly stenciled, was USCG. The Navy had kittens about that. Other vessels somehow or other wound up getting the Coast Guard insignia applied to their stacks, their funnels. The Navy had kittens about that. But I think they were more bureaucratic kittens than anybody really being upset. During World War II, a significant rapport developed between the Marine Corps and the Coast Guard. Because starting with the landings at Guadalcanal in 1942, right up to the end of the war, every amphibious operation at some point had Coast Guard manned ships, including a little landing craft that hustled up to the beaches with Army soldiers or Marines to hit the beach. Both the Atlantic and the Mediterranean and the Pacific. 1939, war clouds were forming, and President Roosevelt, who was very sympathetic to any maritime service, wasn't having any difficulty finally getting money out of Congress for the Navy, but he couldn't get any money out of Congress for the Coast Guard. Well, there was another service called the Lighthouse Service, which was all civil service. They had their own vessels. They maintained all the lightships and lighthouses and aids to navigation, but they were a civilian department. But they were part of the executive branch. Politicians who would not fund any more vessels for the Coast Guard suddenly realized that President Roosevelt, in his usual manner, had one-upped them. He realized that the politicians had no problems with funding lighthouses, because that was something everybody around could see, and it was, the visual thing. And they could say, see, I gave you a new or a rebuilt lighthouse. So the Lighthouse Service had a lot of money. So by executive order in 1939, President Roosevelt merged the Lighthouse Service into the Coast Guard. And suddenly they wound up with a lot more money than they ever thought they would get. We've had Coast Guard World War II veterans here. And they have told me on occasion that they would be aboard some of the smaller, older vessels. When a request would go out, would they like to serve on a new type of anti-submarine ship? Because there were more DEs being built than the Navy could readily get crews for. So suddenly 30 DEs, very, very, very similar to the Slater, wound up getting Coast Guard crews, all the way from the captain down to the lowest seaman or fireman. There were 30 of them. USS Leopold, DE number 319, she was torpedoed by a German submarine, the U-255, just south of Iceland, and she lost 90% of her crew, 178 out of 200 men. Interestingly enough, the majority of the crew did not die from the sinking or the torpedo hit. They died from hypothermia because it was March in the North Atlantic. And you don't last too long in that. During the Cold War, at the beginning of the Korean War, 12 DEs were actually transferred to the Coast Guard. That's where we get the picture on the cake with one painted white. They were given Coast Guard numbers, and they were classified as cutters, and they were used as early weather patrol ships. So the Coast Guard has a historic connection also with destroyer escorts. Coast Guard has been involved during the Cold War. We have some of our Coast Guard veterans here, volunteers, like myself, were in during that time. And there are Coast Guard people still on duty over in the area around Iraq and even in Afghanistan today. So there's kind of a brief, I hope I didn't put you to sleep, a brief summation of Coast Guard history, and especially involving the connection between the Coast Guard and the destroyer escorts.
While we're celebrating the 223rd birthday of the Coast Guard, there's also another person celebrating his birthday today. I believe he's probably our youngest tour guide, Tom Shawn, and I'm not sure where he is. He's aboard someplace. He's in the Guthrie Tub, so maybe if he'd raise his hand, we'd say happy birthday to him. He joins a very exclusive group with the Coast Guard. Now it's a very real pleasure for the USS Slater to fire a volley of 3 shots from our 3-inch 50 in honor of our Coast Guard ship dates on this their special day. Immediately following the volley, the Coast Guard song Semper Paratus will be played. Mr. Collins, when the gun crew is ready, would you please fire? Would you all please rise? All uniformed personnel and veterans, and salute.